So this is actually the fourth video on the Blackheart Allroad that I'm putting out. The first was a review video on the titanium version. The second one was a first impression video on the aluminum version. And the third video was a build/first look video on this frame that was sent over to the channel for review. So I've actually covered the bike quite a bit already, but in this video I want to talk about one thing that I haven't touched upon too much, which is whether or not this bike actually functions well as two different bikes in one. And I'll also offer some semi-long-term thoughts on the bike, including all the things that I like and some of the things that I think could use a little bit of improvement. So quick summary of the build. The bike is built up with a GRX 810 2x group set. I've got 165mm cranks with Garmin power meter pedals. In road mode, I'm running a pair of Loon carbon wheels with Conti GP5000 tubeless tires in 700C by 32mm. And then in gravel mode, I'm running the Logos Epo K carbon wheels with WTB Radlers in 700C by 40mm, also set up tubeless. The stem is an alloy Easton 90mm stem, and the handlebars are the Ritchie Butano bars in 42cm width. It's got a custom Cerakote finish in burnt bronze with a matching carbon fork. It's a size 52 frame, and with pedals and bottle cages installed, it weighs just about 9 kilograms or 19.8 pounds in road mode and 10 kilograms or about 22 pounds in gravel mode. Now, it's definitely the case that gravel bikes exist on a spectrum, and as the name suggests, the Blackheart Allroad leans heavily toward the road end of the spectrum and rides as such. Now, in previous videos, I discussed the geometry at length, but the quick summary here is that this frame leans toward road geometry with a head-tube angle of 71.5 degrees, a rear center of 422mm, and a very short wheelbase at 1002mm for this size 52 frame. Now, when I put the road wheels on, it's definitely my fastest, most responsive bike in the stable. I did a metric century in San Diego last November on this setup in road mode, and it was definitely the easiest time that I've had on this ride, which at this point I've done 6 or 7 times, but always on a gravel bike with slick tires. Now, I don't actually keep a dedicated road bike in the garage here, so I'm not comparing the Blackheart Allroad to an actual race bike. It's definitely not that. But when this bike is set up in road mode, the Allroad does feel kind of similar to like an endurance road bike to some degree. It's fast for sure, and it's plenty road for my needs. But then again, keep in mind, I'm not racing, and I primarily enjoy having a road-ish bike simply because it requires less effort to pedal than, say, a heavier, more relaxed geometry gravel bike. Then when I do put the gravel wheel set on, it really completely changes the feel of the bike. Now, it's still moderately fast on the road with the knobby 40mm tires, but more importantly, it's remarkably capable off-road. Now, in my head, I've had some preconceived notions about the handling of an all-road bike off-road. Namely that with a twitchier road-leaning geometry, it might become unruly and hard to control when the going gets rough. But so far, I actually haven't found that to be the case. I mean, sure, it's definitely not as stable as like the Specialized Diverge or the Ritchie Outback on steeper, chunkier descents, but the Blackheart Allroad has surprised me in how far I can push it before it gets a little bit too sketchy. Now, I've done all my local routes here in SoCal, which include some fast fire roads, loose dirt, mud, and ruts, and even some switchbacky single track in the Turnbull Canyon area, and this bike has done it all with no issues. Now, I'm definitely a little bit more cautious when I'm on this bike, but I've actually come to enjoy the challenge of underbiking in some instances, and I definitely appreciate the snappiness of the Allroad's geometry everywhere else. So to attempt to answer the question in the video's title, I would say that pure roadies will probably never compromise on a quote 2-in-1 bike, and the leisurely cycle tourist would probably never see the need for all-road geometry. But for everyone else who's somewhere in the middle, if you're someone who maybe appreciates a quick and nimble road machine for the occasional spirited road event, but who is also drawn to explore local trails on a sporty and capable gravel bike, the all-road concept, I think, works pretty well. Now, I think it's definitely a fine balance to tune the geometry to suit both road and gravel disciplines, but I do think Blackheart have done a pretty solid job here with this bike. Now, for me, the Blackheart Allroad has actually been the bike that I've been reaching for most of the time these days. I'll generally pick the Blackheart over the Diverge because it's faster on the road portion of mixed terrain rides. And to be honest, the gravel routes here in Southern California, in my opinion, don't really call for anything more slack and stable than what this all-road provides. And then for any other mostly dirt, slightly gnarlier gravel outing, I'll typically reach for the Ritchey Outback just because it's a little bit more planted and it can run wider tires. Which is actually a good segue into some of the things that can be improved on the all-road, because this bike here has a max tire clearance of 40 millimeters for 700C wheels. If you check out the build video, I tried running the Ritchey Cross Max tires in 700C by 40 millimeters, but those tires actually ran quite a bit wide, and they actually measured out to 43 millimeters, and they simply would not fit the rear triangle of the Blackheart. Now, the width wasn't as much of an issue, but the tire itself was relatively tall, and so it would rub against the back of the seat post, so unfortunately I couldn't use those. So as a minor gripe, I kind of wish the all-road would take a slightly wider tire, maybe like a 42 millimeter tire, and I think it would cover most bases. However, Blackheart did recently just release a bona fide gravel frame set, which does have a wider tire clearance, so it may have been a strategic decision to limit the clearance on the all-road. Nonetheless, running 40 millimeter tires so far hasn't really proven to be a limitation for me anyways. Now, there are a couple other things that I noticed, and I think anyone considering buying this bike should probably know. So the rear brake caliper mount was an issue for me, both from a design perspective as well as a practical perspective. Now, if you notice here, the caliper mount consists of a pair of flanges that protrude from the rear non-drive side chainstay. Now, the fact that there's a gap between the upper and lower flange produces a bending moment, such that when you're tightening the caliper bolts, the upper flange wants to bend downward and the lower flange tends to want to bend upward. Now, from a design point of view, this really just doesn't make sense to me. The brake caliper mounting surface really needs to be perfectly normal to the plane of the rotor, otherwise the caliper won't align properly. And I've actually checked every other bike in the garage here, and every one has a solid mounting post for the brake caliper. Now, the fact that there's no gap eliminates any bending moment, and so no matter how tight the caliper mounting bolts get, there won't be any tendency for the caliper to want to rotate. Now, practically speaking, on the Blackheart here, the effect is pretty small, but I did encounter a little bit of frustration when trying to align the rear caliper. So in my case, I'd have the caliper lined up perfectly with the bolts just barely snug down, and there would be no rubbing of the rotor and the brake pads. And then when I would torque the bolts to spec, you could actually see the caliper tending to cant or lean inward just slightly, but enough to introduce some rubbing. So what I'd have to do is actually align the caliper so that it was slightly rubbing the inner brake pad, so that when I did torque it to spec, the caliper would cant inward slightly and eliminate the rub. I know, it's definitely not ideal. Now, it is possible that I received a pre-production unit that wasn't in its final form, but to me, this does seem like a little bit of an oversight at the design phase. Okay, so another thing that is slightly irksome is that it can't use this type of rotor lock ring. So there are a couple of different styles of disc rotor lock ring, a smaller, lower profile one that uses a cassette tool like this one, and then a larger, more boxy type of design that uses a bottom bracket tool like this one. So the problem that I ran into is if you try and use this bigger type of lock ring in the front, there's actually kind of a bulbous protrusion on the non-drive side of the fork that will actually rub part of the lock ring when the wheel is mounted and torqued down. And it's actually enough to do some damage to the fork if you actually try and ride the bike like this. So you definitely have to make sure you're using the lower profile disc rotor lock ring. And you know, it's somewhat of a minor issue, but I don't have any other bikes that have the same issue. And then lastly, there was one concern that I had with the seat post. Now, the stock carbon seat post that comes with the frame uses a pretty typical design for clamping the saddle. It's like a two-plate system with two clamping bolts that are secured by two threaded cylindrical nuts. Now, the torque spec for these bolts was questionably high at 12 Newton meters, but I did follow the torque spec, and what happened was that these cylindrical nuts actually started to buckle as the tension in the clamping bolts increased. Now, it was subtle at first, but I noticed it when it became increasingly harder just to thread the bolts through. And so what was happening was that the threaded hole was actually becoming ovalized and distorted as the cylindrical nut started to bend due to the tension in the bolt. So I was sent some replacement hardware for the seat post, but ultimately I ended up using a different post altogether. Now, I do think this problem can be solved pretty easily just by using a beefier nut or revisiting the required torque spec, because 12 Newton meters for a saddle pinch bolt does seem awfully high. Okay, so despite a couple of minor gripes that I've had with the bike so far, I really do enjoy riding the Blackheart Allroad aluminum version. Now, if you're curious on my take between the aluminum version and the titanium version, definitely check out my first video on the aluminum Allroad, and for all other things like ride quality and handling, you can check out the discussion in the other videos as well. Overall, I think the Allroad aluminum is an awesome bike. And to answer the question of whether a quote 2-in-1 bike like this makes sense and actually performs in both road and gravel configurations, My take so far is generally yes, unless you're on either extreme of this bike's intended use. Now in road mode, the bike is plenty road for me, and in gravel mode, I feel pretty confident riding the bike off-road, despite its more road-centric geometry. Okay, so that's going to do it for now. If you have any questions about this bike or my experience with it so far, just leave them down in the comments and I'll do my best to respond to as many as possible. Thanks again for watching, and thanks for subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. I'll see you next time.